Do you get frustrated when you see the suburban landscape turning into the same thing over and over and over again? I certainly do, and I know that there is a better and more interesting way to do what homeowners are trying to achieve on a budget. I just don't think they know how to get there. So today I want to tackle that problem. Hey everyone, I'm Erin, the Impatient Gardener. I live and garden here in southeastern Wisconsin, zone 5B, 6A. I am a master gardener volunteer, and I have designed a bunch of gardens, both at my property and others. And I am so frustrated by what I see happening when I drive past the same houses all the time. And I do not blame the homeowners for what's going on. So our case study that we're going to be designing a new landscape on a very tight budget for today is a house that I figure I have driven by more than 10,000 times in the last 20 years. I drive by this house twice a day, every single weekday, because it is on my route to and from work. Not to mention, this is in the town where I grew up, so I'm very, very, very familiar with this house. When I was a kid, we used to go to this house to buy watermelons from the he seemed like a very old man at the time, and now I fear he may have been like in his 70s or something, which is not old. So anyway, I call it the Watermelon Man's house. Nobody else does. This is a very cute, smallish house that is on the main drag into town. It is on a corner lot. It is in a very busy part of the street. It is very exposed where it is. Now, I've watched the landscaping change at this house over the years, but the last owner before the current owner was not there for that long, and they took out quite a bit of some landscaping that was there. Now, there was never a lot of it, but they took out a fair amount of it, and there's a good chance that they took it out because it was just old. In spring, new people moved in. Now, I don't know these people. They don't know that I'm gonna create a new landscape for their house, but I'm gonna assume something. So although this sounds creeperish, remember, I just drive by this house all the time. So I think it's kind of a young couple. I'm going to imagine in my head this might be their first home. And I also remember what it's like to buy our first home. And I remember that you pour every bit of money you have into buying your house, typically. And sometimes there are some necessary upgrades that need to be made on the inside. And I get that landscaping is farther down the list of priorities. Now, I mentioned that this is a really exposed spot. I'm assuming that the large picture window that's on the front of the house is maybe a living room. And I can only imagine what it's like to try to sit in that room with headlights going by at night, or being able to have everyone see in. So privacy is obviously a huge issue. So these new homeowners did what I see people do everywhere. They planted 15 small arborvitaes. I'm going to say these are less than 2 feet tall. I did ask people for some indication of what they thought someone might pay for a plant like that. The general idea, and what I've kind of seen around here, is that my guess is they went to probably a big box store, and I'm going to guess they paid maybe $25 for these plants. That's the number I'm going to work off of. In addition, in the corner of their property, they planted 4 shrubs. I think at least 2 of them are small hydrangeas, and there might be something else there. They're all very small shrubs. And I get what they're trying to do. They are desperate for privacy, as anybody would be. They may or may not have looked at the price of fencing, which would be, this is actually a pretty big city lot. They have quite a big backyard in it. I can only imagine how much fencing would be. And I don't actually even know what the fencing regulations in the city are, because as I drive down that street, no one has a fence. So they might have only been able to get a 4-foot fence there, which isn't going to really do them much good from a privacy standpoint. So it might not even be worth the money, even if they wanted to spend that money. What they did on this property, you can drive around town, you can drive around new builds, you will see a version of the exact same thing. If you aren't into gardening and aren't a student of gardens, or have never really paid much attention to gardens, which probably describes many first-time homeowners who have never really even thought about gardening until all of a sudden they own a property and they need to figure out some landscaping, you probably know that you see this same thing. A line of arborvitaes with maybe some daylilies thrown in, a spirea, and a couple hydrangeas. At least in my area of the country, that is essentially the generic, most common landscape that you will see. So I'm going to make some assumptions here and say that maybe they spent $600 on these 4 shrubs and these 15 arborvitaes. And I think $600 is probably a very typical amount of money that a brand new homeowner moving into a property would want to spend. Unfortunately, I'm going to tell you why all of that $600 was a big waste of money, and they don't know it. This might have even been an arborvitae that wasn't even named where they bought it, but let's just assume this is a pretty generic arborvitae. So here are some of the problems with it. And by the way, I'm working off of a couple of photos that I snapped from across the street and some Google images here. And although of course I could have stood right on the sidewalk outside their house and take pictures, I didn't want to seem like a total creeper. I don't think most people would appreciate that. So the pictures are not optimal here, but between the Google images, I think you can, and what I took, I think you can get a feel for what we're talking about with this property. So first off, they've spaced out these arborvitaes quite a bit. Now, maybe they're intending on adding more in the future, but we're just going to make some assumptions on what's happening here. I would say it's going to be at least 10 years before any of those plants are creating, are touching, which I assume is their intention. But the problem is I don't think any of those arborvitaes are ever going to make that. So first of all, you'll note that the way they planted these was they dug a hole the size of the root ball and they planted it in. There is grass all around it. So you know that that grass is sucking up a lot of water. And in fact, this fall, one of the things I noticed was that they had been watering the trees, which I could tell because there was a ring of extra green grass around them. So they were keeping up on watering the trees. Big kudos to them on that. But that grass is going to suck up a ton of that water. If you were going to do this, a far better way to plant that would be to dig out a strip at least 2 feet wide, the entire length, plant them in there, and then mulch between them. That would have been a much better way to do that if you were going to go ahead with this planting. The other thing is that these arborvitaes are, in my opinion, the wrong plant for here, because although they grow fairly quickly, they're never going to make it that long for a couple of reasons. The first is deer. Believe it or not, downtown, this part of the city has a really big deer problem. There is a herd of deer that live in town that is happy to munch on anything and everywhere. They have actually eaten the plants that I have planted outside our office, which there is no grass anywhere near that. They are just walking through paved streets right down the sidewalk eating plants. About once every 1 or 2 weeks, I will have to stop for deer in town to cross the street, and they don't care. They have no enemies. No one's hunting them. There is a buck who walks around like he owns the place, which he pretty much does. He's an 8-point buck. I'm sure hunters are salivating when they see that. And he walks around like he's got not a care in the world because no one's hunting him, no one's going to move him out, and he's got a whole lot of does out there who are just hanging out waiting for him. So he thinks he is pretty hot stuff, and he saunters across the street and makes all the cars stop for him. So deer are a problem. Deer will absolutely go after these arborvitaes. That is the other thing we see when these landscapes are planted, is anywhere there are deer, they might get them established, but if they don't actually put pretty ugly deer fencing around them for winter, a lot of people actually use snow fence, they will be lollipop trees in no time. The other problem is dogs. These people live on the main sidewalk in town, which means I can only guess at the number of dogs who are walking by this property every day. And I know these dogs are peeing on those trees because shortly after the trees went in, so did a bunch of signs that said, please don't let your dogs pee here. The other thing is they planted these maybe 18 inches from the sidewalk, which means that these trees are going to get way too big for that spot width-wise, covering up the sidewalk, which the city is not going to allow, before they ever get close to meeting. And lastly, the big problem with any kind of hedge, if you plant a hedge that is made up of all the same trees, the odds of all of those living, especially when you're starting with really small plants, is nearly impossible. You're going to lose some, and then it's never going to look right. Now, again, I want to just be perfectly clear here. I don't blame these people who did this at all. This is what they see out there growing. This is what they think should be done. And I'm sure when they started looking at other options, they thought this is the best way to get us some privacy. But I have a much better plan. So let's walk through what I would do with that $600. So I think when people think about creating privacy, they think about creating a wall. But that's not the only way to create a sense of privacy. And I think that a much better way to approach this problem would be to create privacy basically almost instantaneously in the area that is the most exposed, and that is the corner. So most of the headlights, when we're talking about cars, are going to be hitting right at that corner. So if we can create a really nice block on that corner, that will create a much better feeling of privacy both inside and I think outside. So what I'm proposing here is using that corner, creating a garden bed there, ripping out all that grass on the corner, and we're going to create this nice curvy bed on the corner, and we're going to plant that intensely. So the first thing we're going to add to this bed is a nice, dense, wider evergreen. And I'm going to propose not an arborvitae here because we want to think about deer resistance here. Deer resistance and just general city toughness. I'm thinking some kind of spruce would be nice here. And ideally something, I mean, you could have something that grows up to 20 feet tall here, would be just fine over time. But my guess is these people are going to live in this house for maybe 10 or 15 years. And then they're maybe moving on to the next house. And I think if you are planting a new garden, you just worry about yourself. What happens with that garden down the road, you can let the next people decide what they're going to do because they might hate it anyway. So maybe we're looking at a spruce, and I'm thinking a nice size one that's going to get you some privacy, hopefully immediately. Like maybe we can get something that's at least 4 feet tall from the get-go, maybe even bigger. We're going to put at least a third of our budget into this tree because this is the tree that's going to solve part of the problem from day one. So the next thing that we're going to dedicate a good portion of the budget to is a small flowering tree. And this should be something that's going to be wide, not columnar, because again, wide and low, this is a ranch house after all, wide and low is going to get us the most screening, and it's not going to overwhelm the house. So this could be something like a crabapple, this could be a multi-stem serviceberry, this could be something like heptacodium, seven suns tree. There are a lot of options out there. This could be maybe even a hawthorn, something like that. And by the way, of course, this is all full sun, so there are a lot of options here for things that could go in this spot. I'm going to say maybe you can get it, if you go for something that isn't too wild and crazy, I bet you could get a very nicely sized tree for maybe $150. So we're going to put that in the south corner of this garden bed, but on the edge that's closer to the house. So we're going to put in a nice, tough panicle hydrangea that's going to grow fairly big. I'm not thinking limelight, but this could be limelight prime, which is 6 to 8 feet tall. We could do something that gets in that sort of 5 to 6 foot range. That could be little lime, that could be quickfire. I really love quickfire. There, as we all know, there is no limit to the hydrangeas you could pick from. So this could be something where, you know, they could actually like pick a budget option even to see what would be there. But I would think 6 feet tall would be a really nice height for that to grow to. And of course, if you keep those flowers on in winter, that's going to provide screening in winter too. And I would say start with a bigger plant for that. We want to get privacy instantaneously because these people's patience is going to wear out if they have to wait for too long. So I'm going to say probably $60 for a plant like that. $65 could even be if we're looking at like a 3-gallon kind of plant. And then the next thing I want to add in, because I want to get some movement here, but also again, screening quickly, I'm going to add in a couple of ornamental grasses. And actually I've drawn in 2, but I really think, you know, hate 2 of anything, honestly. So there's probably a spot to work in a third one. Looking for quite a tall one, but a well-mannered one, because I'm going to assume that these people are not really that interested in gardening at this point in their lives, maybe ever. But based on what I saw them planting, I don't think that these are necessarily people for whom the gardening bug has bit yet. So we want low maintenance, and we don't want anything that's going to reseed all over the place. So this could be something like good old-fashioned Carl Forester, which stands up really well. I don't want something that's going to get floppy and they're going to have to worry about it falling onto the sidewalk. There are also some really good millennias that would work there. And by the time we put those things in, I feel like the budget is getting close to being used up. So I have a couple of options for where they could go next year. Because remember, now we've got this big bed that is, all that grass is removed and it's gonna look a little empty. So while it's not nearly as fun as having a finished, beautiful garden in front of you, I think when budget is a big concern, I think a staged garden plan is a pretty good idea. So for the first year of this bed, what I would suggest they do is they're gonna plant these plants that we've talked about and these trees. But before they mulch anything except for the areas right around the tree, they're gonna throw down a whole bunch of zinnia seeds. And I'm talking about tall zinnias. I'm talking about state fair zinnias, zinnias that get some height to them. And I'm gonna propose that they just fill this whole thing up with zinnias for this first year. This should not be that hard. Zinnias generally grow very well from seed. They're gonna have nice fresh soil there that's all worked up. If we're worried about weeds, potentially they could mulch around the edges where a lot of weeds or grass is bound to creep in. And they could create just holes. And that would still work really well. And then leave big holes, and that's where you put the zinnia seed. And that maybe provides a little bit more structure for someone who isn't quite sure how to decipher what a zinnia seedling is and a weed is. And we're just gonna fill this up with zinnias this first year. Now, zinnias themselves are not gonna provide any, screening in winter. So they're not great as far as that goes, but they are gonna create a really nice feeling of enclosure, which is as equally as important as actually blocking what you're seeing, I think. So that's my cheap way to get through that first year. And I think that leaves money in the budget, probably enough money to get yourself some mulch and whatever else you need to do to get those plants established. And then you just focus on keeping that happy for the first year. So let's say that they look at this and they think, we love where this is going. We can find a little bit more money this year to add some stuff in. The next place I'd go is super tough perennials. And again, we're looking mostly at height here and probably on the front edge towards their house, we're gonna stair step that down. But for the middle and back, we're talking about height. So I'm thinking Agastache Blue Fortune would be an excellent addition there. That stands up over winter too, so you leave that standing and you get something there instead of a bare landscape. Echinacea, I wouldn't fuss around with fancy echinaceas. I'd go for good old-fashioned Echinacea purpurea, which reseeds around, comes back reliably, asks for very little, looks beautiful during the winter as well. Now this house has always had sort of a pink or purple door, so that's why I'm thinking pink, but if they wanted to go to like a yellow thing, certainly you could add in some Rudbeckia. American Gold Rush would be a perfect one for that. Also sedums, now I'm thinking that kind of front edge, that'd be great for there. I mean, I think if they wanted to, we could also look at adding in some smaller shrubs. Obviously you could put in some more hydrangeas there, certainly. A flowerful hydrangea actually in the middle of that bed would actually be quite interesting. Smaller shrubs though, you could think about something like Fothergilla, Legends of the Small. I absolutely love that. Clethra, just fallen in love with Clethra. I think Clethra is a beautiful little shrub as well. Of course, there's so many really, really good small shrubs now that there's really no limit. I guess I would probably pick one of those and plant those in multiples. This is a very small bed and it's gonna get a little mishmashy if you start throwing in too much. Now just for fun, because I can't resist a big garden, I drew just the beginning sketch of what a bed might look like that would really enclose this house and really make this feel private and give these people the sense of enclosure and privacy that I would certainly want if I lived in this house. And that is basically creating almost a circle around the entire house. That would give them protection from that side street, which by the way, that side street is not super well traveled, so that's why I'm not as worried about what's happening on that side street, but it would certainly enclose you from that area. And it would create a really interesting sort of lawn area going around the house. Now, like I said, they have a big backyard, so I don't feel bad taking out a lot of grass that we have in the front because you got a whole backyard to play with there. They do have a couple of Alberta spruces on the corner of those houses. Those are ancient. Those have been there as long as I can remember. Certainly they could leave those in if they like those. And then of course I would create a foundation planting to add a little bit of interest against the house as well. And then that creates essentially a garden in the front that is a very wide, shapely path around the house and then opens up to that backyard. So if you happen to be in this position, I hope this helps you rethink how you could spend a small budget to create almost instantaneous privacy that is also going to grow better, last longer, and I think be a much more beautiful planting than something like a line of little arborvitaes. I hold no ill will towards arborvitae. There can be very nice plants in the right place and in the right position and asked to do the right job, none of which I think applies to this particular instance. All right, if you found this interesting or helpful, do me a favor, give a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this kind of idea of coming up with design ideas for people who never asked me to come up with design ideas. All right, thank you for watching. Have a great day in your garden. We'll see you soon.